I still remember the exact moment I realized we were lost. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows through the dense trees of the forest. As the last rays of daylight faded, the sense of unease that had been gnawing at me since we entered the forest grew into full-blown panic. The Enchanted Forest, a place whispered about in fearful tones, was living up to its sinister reputation. It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip, a weekend getaway to escape the stresses of our daily lives. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Mark, his sister Emily, and our mutual friend Josh. We had heard rumors about the forest, about a witch who had cursed it long ago, but we brushed them off as local folklore. We were seasoned hikers, after all. We could handle a few spooky stories. As the darkness closed in around us, we realized how foolish we had been. The path we had been following had seemingly vanished, swallowed up by the thick undergrowth and twisted roots. Our phones were useless. There was no signal in this part of the forest. Panic set in quickly as we tried to retrace our steps, but every direction we turned seemed to lead us deeper into the labyrinth of trees. "Let's just stay calm," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to find a spot to set up camp for the night. We'll figure things out in the morning." His words made sense, but the fear in his eyes betrayed his calm demeanor. We found a small clearing and hastily set up our tents. The forest was unnervingly silent, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. We sat around a small fire, the flickering flames casting grotesque shadows on the trees around us. "Do you think the stories are true?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the witch and the curse?" "No way," Josh scoffed, though his bravado felt forced. "It's just a bunch of nonsense to scare people. We'll find our way out in the morning." I wanted to believe him, but something about this place felt wrong. The air was thick with a sense of malevolence, as if the forest itself was watching us. As we settled into our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. I woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching on the leaves outside our tent. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving in a circle around our campsite. I glanced at Sarah, who was still asleep, and quietly unzipped the tent. Peering out, I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. The figure was tall and thin, draped in a tattered cloak that seemed to blend into the shadows. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. I froze, unable to move or make a sound. The figure raised a skeletal hand and pointed directly at me. A wave of terror washed over me, and I scrambled back into the tent, shaking Sarah awake. "There's someone out there," I whispered urgently. "We need to get out of here." We woke the others, and without wasting any time, we packed up our gear and set off into the night, hoping to put as much distance between us and whatever that thing was. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and contorting as if to block our path. Every step felt like a struggle, the air growing colder and more oppressive. As we stumbled through the darkness, we began to hear other sounds, whispers that seemed to come from the very trees themselves, low and guttural. Mark was the first to crack, muttering to himself and swatting at invisible insects. Emily clung to him, tears streaming down her face. "We need to keep moving," Sarah urged, her voice trembling. "We can't stop now." But it was too late. The forest was alive with malevolent energy, and it was toying with us. We saw shadows flitting between the trees, eyes gleaming in the darkness. Once, I turned and saw a grotesque figure, hunched and gnarled, grinning at me with jagged teeth. When I blinked, it was gone. Hours passed in a blur of fear and disorientation. The trees seemed to shift and move, the forest itself reshaping to trap us. Exhaustion took its toll, and we collapsed in another small clearing, too spent to go any further. "We're never getting out of here, are we?" Josh said, his voice hollow. "We're going to die in this cursed place." "No," Sarah said fiercely. "We can't give up. There has to be a way out." But even as she spoke, I could see the defeat in her eyes. The forest had us in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. We huddled together, trying to find some comfort in each other's presence, but the oppressive silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. It was Emily. She had wandered a few steps away from the group, and now she was staring into the darkness, her eyes wide with terror. We rushed to her side, but it was too late. She was pointing at something we couldn't see, her face twisted in a rictus of fear. "They're coming for us," she whispered. "The witch's minions. They're coming for us all." We saw them then, figures emerging from the shadows, their forms twisted and grotesque. They moved with unnatural speed, circling us, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. We fought, but it was useless. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. One by one, they dragged us into the darkness. I saw Mark taken first, his screams echoing through the trees. Josh and Sarah tried to hold on to each other, but they were torn apart. I was left alone, paralyzed by fear, as the creatures closed in around me. In the end, there was only darkness. The forest had claimed us, just as the stories said it would. And now, as I write this, I know that I am not alone. The witch's curse is real, and her minions are watching, waiting for their next victims. If you ever find yourself near the Enchanted Forest, turn back. Do not enter, for once you are inside, the forest will never let you go. Moving to a new town is always an adventure, but for me, it was a necessity. After the dissolution of my marriage and losing my job in quick succession, I needed a fresh start, a place where I could begin again without the heavy burdens of my past. The small town of Alderwood seemed perfect, picturesque, friendly, and promising. Its prosperity was a stark contrast to the dying towns I'd seen along the way, and I felt a pull towards its vibrant life. The townsfolk were welcoming, almost unnervingly so. It felt as if they were expecting me, and before I knew it, I had a job at the local library and a quaint little house at the edge of the town. My first few weeks were blissful, exploring the winding streets, getting to know my neighbors, and immersing myself in the serene, almost timeless atmosphere of Alderwood. But then I started to notice things, small, unsettling oddities that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It began with the way people would sometimes stop and stare at me, their eyes dark and knowing, as if they were silently evaluating me. At first, I brushed it off as small-town curiosity, but the feeling of being watched never fully left me. One evening, while organizing some old books in the library's basement, I stumbled upon a dusty, leather-bound tome. Its title, The History of Alderwood, piqued my interest. I blew off the dust and began to read, expecting tales of settlers and development. What I found was something far more sinister. The book detailed the town's founding in the early 1700s, and its struggles to thrive in a harsh and unforgiving land. The turning point came with the arrival of a woman named Eliza Crowley. Described as an enigmatic figure, she was both revered and feared by the early residents. According to the book, Eliza was a healer, capable of curing the sick and blessing the crops. But her powers came at a cost. The townspeople struck a deal with her prosperity and protection in exchange for their absolute loyalty and a periodic offering. The term offering was vague, and the more I read, the less I understood. The book's pages seemed to stop abruptly, as if the story had been deliberately cut short. I closed the book, a sense of unease settling in my stomach. What kind of pact had the townspeople made, and what did it mean for Alderwood today? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered something I wasn't meant to know. My curiosity turned into an obsession. I began to ask subtle questions, testing the waters with my neighbors. Most dismissed my inquiries with polite smiles, but a few showed visible discomfort. It was clear that whatever this pact was, it was still very much a part of the town's fabric. One night, I decided to visit the old church at the heart of Alderwood. It was a grand, Gothic structure that seemed out of place in such a small town. The doors were always open, welcoming anyone in need of solace or prayer. I slipped inside and made my way to the basement, where the church kept its records. By the flickering light of a single candle, I pored over birth records, death certificates, and minutes from town meetings. My heart raced as I pieced together a timeline. Every 25 years, there was a spike in deaths, mostly unexplained, often entire families wiped out in a single night. The last spike had been exactly 25 years ago. And then I found it, a faded document that made my blood run cold. It was a contract, signed in 1720 by the town's founders and Eliza Crowley. It detailed the terms of the pact. Every quarter century, an offering would be made to ensure the town's continued prosperity. The offering was a life, no lives, an entire family. I sat back, my hands trembling. The pattern was clear, and the next offering was due any day now. Panic set in as I realized the implications. The townspeople knew, of course they knew. That's why they were so welcoming, so eager to integrate me into their community. They needed new blood, a fresh sacrifice to uphold their end of the bargain. I had to get out. I had to warn someone, but who would believe me? I quickly gathered the documents and stuffed them into my bag, then rushed back to my house. As I approached, I saw a group of townspeople gathered outside, their faces solemn. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized they were waiting for me. "Come with us," Emily said. Mr. Thompson, the kindly old man who ran the general store. His tone was gentle, but there was a steely resolve in his eyes. It's time you understood the truth. They led me to the town hall, a grand building that seemed almost alive with the whispers of generations past. Inside, the entire town had gathered, their faces a mixture of sorrow and resignation. At the front of the hall stood a portrait of Eliza Crowley, her eyes seeming to bore into my soul. Mayor Grayson stepped forward, holding the same contract I had found. "Emily," he began, "you've discovered our secret. Alderwood's prosperity is not by chance. It is the result of a pact made centuries ago, a pact we are bound to uphold." "You can't be serious," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "This is madness. You can't just kill people for this." "It's not something we take lightly," Mayor Grayson replied, his expression grave. "But it is our duty. The offering ensures our survival, our prosperity. Without it, Alderwood would wither and die." I looked around the room, searching for any sign of dissent, but there was none. These people, my neighbors and friends, were complicit in this horror. "And what happens if you don't make the offering?" I demanded. "What if you refuse?" "The consequences are dire," Mr. Thompson said softly. "The last time the pact was broken, the town was ravaged by disease and famine. We cannot let that happen again." As the gravity of their words sank in, a chilling wind swept through the hall. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. A voice, soft and melodious, filled the room. "The time has come," it whispered. The townspeople fell to their knees, bowing their heads in reverence. I turned to see a figure materializing at the back of the hall. Eliza Crowley, as beautiful and terrifying as her portrait, stood before us. Her eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto mine. "You have discovered the truth," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "And now you must decide. Will you uphold the pact, or will you doom this town to ruin?" I felt a surge of defiance. "This is wrong," I cried. "You can't demand innocent lives for your own gain." Eliza's smile was cold and unforgiving. "The pact is unbreakable. The offering must be made, or the town will suffer." I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. They were willing to sacrifice me, to sacrifice anyone, to protect their precious town. But I couldn't accept that. I couldn't be a part of this cycle of death and despair. "No," I said firmly. "I won't be your sacrifice." Eliza's expression darkened, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Then you leave me no choice," she hissed. Before I could react, the townspeople surged forward, their hands grasping at me. I fought back, but there were too many. They dragged me to the front of the hall, forcing me to my knees before Eliza. "This is your fate," she whispered, her voice filled with dark promise. "You cannot escape it." As she raised her hands, chanting in a language I couldn't understand, I felt a cold, creeping darkness envelop me. My vision blurred, and a terrible pain shot through my body. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. When I awoke, I was lying in my bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a nightmare, but the ache in my bones and the lingering sense of dread told me otherwise. I stumbled to the mirror and gasped. My hair had turned stark white, and deep lines etched my face. I looked decades older, my youth and vitality drained away. I knew then that I had been spared, but at a terrible cost. The town had made its offering, and Eliza Crowley had taken her due. Alderwood would continue to prosper, its dark secret buried for another 25 years. I left the town that day, unable to bear the weight of its twisted legacy. But the memories haunted me, a constant reminder of the price of prosperity and the darkness that lurked beneath Alderwood's idyllic surface. I knew that someday, someone else would uncover the truth, and the cycle would begin anew. My name is Samuel Hawthorne, and I have lived in the small village of Blackwood all my life. Nestled deep in the heart of the English countryside, Blackwood is a place where time seems to stand still. The cobblestone streets, the old stone cottages, and the dense woods that surround us all give the impression that the modern world has forgotten us. Yet, beneath its picturesque surface, Blackwood holds dark secrets. One such secret is the tale of Evelyn Blackwood, the woman who was wrongfully executed as a witch nearly 100 years ago. The elders speak of her in hushed tones, and children are warned never to venture into the woods alone, especially at night. Despite these warnings, we all lived our lives in relative peace until recently. It started with small things, animals going missing, strange noises at night, and an uneasy feeling that settled over the village like a thick fog. At first, we dismissed these events as the workings of wild animals or the overactive imaginations of the villagers. But as the occurrences grew more frequent and more sinister, we could no longer ignore the signs. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft whispering outside my window. I froze, straining to catch the words, but they were too faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I could make out fragments of a chant. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled the covers over my head, hoping that whatever it was would go away. The next morning, I found strange symbols drawn in the dirt outside my house. They were unlike anything I had ever seen, intricate and menacing. I knew I had to find out what was happening, not just for my own sanity but for the safety of the village. I turned to the village historian, Mrs. Thorne, a woman well-versed in the lore and legends of Blackwood. She welcomed me into her cluttered home, filled with dusty tomes and relics from the past. I told her about the whispering and the symbols, and she listened intently, her expression growing more grave with each word. Evelyn Blackwood, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. They say she was wrongfully accused of witchcraft and executed without a fair trial. Her spirit has never rested. But why now, I asked. Why after all these years? Mrs. Thorne shook her head. I don't know, but the signs point to her return. We must be cautious. The strange occurrences continued to escalate. People reported seeing a shadowy figure at the edge of the woods, watching the village with eyes that glowed in the dark. Children spoke of a woman with long, dark hair who whispered their names from the shadows. The livestock became restless, and crops began to wither for no apparent reason. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a thick mist rolled in from the woods. It crept through the village, blanketing everything in an eerie silence. I was at the local tavern, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread, when we heard a blood-curdling scream. We rushed outside to find old Mr. Collins collapsed on the ground, his eyes wide with terror. We carried him to his home, but he never woke up. His death marked the beginning of a series of tragedies that would soon engulf Blackwood. Desperate for answers, I delved into the village archives, hoping to find anything that could explain what was happening. I spent hours poring over old records, letters, and diaries, piecing together the story of Evelyn Blackwood. Evelyn had been a healer, using her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies to help the sick and injured, but her success had aroused jealousy and suspicion among the villagers. When a particularly harsh winter led to a spate of illnesses and deaths, the villagers, desperate for someone to blame, accused her of witchcraft. She was tried and executed, her body buried in an unmarked grave in the woods. As I read the accounts of her trial, I felt a growing sense of horror and guilt. Evelyn had been innocent, a victim of fear and ignorance. And now, it seemed, she had returned to exact her revenge. One night, I gathered a small group of villagers, including Mrs. Thorne, and we ventured into the woods. Armed with torches and whatever courage we could muster, we followed the path to the place where Evelyn's grave was said to be. The woods were unnaturally quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. We found the grave, a simple mound of earth marked only by a single twisted tree. As we stood there, a cold wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing our torches. In the darkness, we heard the whispering again, growing louder, more insistent. Evelyn Blackwood, Mrs. Thorne called out, her voice trembling. We seek to make amends. We acknowledge the wrong done to you. Please, let us find peace. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Evelyn Blackwood stood before us, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. She was beautiful and terrifying, her presence both ethereal and solid. You seek peace, she hissed. There can be no peace, not until justice is served. With a wave of her hand, the ground trembled, and the air grew thick with the smell of earth and decay. You must understand my suffering, she said. Only then can you hope to end this curse. We fell to our knees as a vision engulfed us. We saw the trial, felt the fear and anger of the villagers, and witnessed Evelyn's final moments. Her pain and despair were overwhelming, and tears streamed down my face as I realized the full extent of her torment. When the vision ended, Evelyn looked at us, her expression softer but still filled with sorrow. Do you see now? Do you understand? Yes, I whispered. We were wrong. We were so wrong. Evelyn nodded, and the tension in the air seemed to ease. There is one way to end this, she said. You must uncover the truth and tell my story. Only then will my spirit be at peace. We returned to the village, determined to fulfill Evelyn's request. With the help of Mrs. Thorne, I wrote an account of Evelyn Blackwood's life and death, detailing the injustice she had suffered. We shared the story with the villagers, and a solemn ceremony was held to honor her memory. The strange occurrences began to subside, and a sense of normalcy returned to Blackwood. Evelyn's spirit, it seemed, had finally found peace. Her grave was marked with a proper headstone, and the village vowed never to forget the lessons of the past. Years have passed since that fateful time, and Blackwood has changed in many ways. The village is still small and quiet, but there is a new sense of awareness and respect for the past. Evelyn Blackwood's story is now a part of our history, a reminder of the dangers of fear and ignorance. As for me, I often visit her grave, leaving flowers and whispering words of gratitude. Evelyn's revenge was not one of destruction, but of revelation. Through her, we learn to confront our darkest truths and seek redemption. And though her presence is no longer felt, I believe that somewhere, Evelyn Blackwood watches over us, a guardian spirit who found justice and, in turn, brought peace to Blackwood. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.